Hi, I'm Andrew Harvey. I'm talking to Ben Smith about his talk for RubyConf AU. And Ben, thank you so much for taking some time out to chat with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, I mean, you're flying across from Boulder to Sydney, and you're going to be talking about, well, your talk title is how I architected my big Rails app for success.
hmm
Um, Now, it's quite interesting. It's obviously a topic which was quite hot. I noticed it at RailsConf last year, and it's obviously a problem that people are running into a bit more. What? Why is this a problem that we're only experiencing 10 years into Rails, or seeming to really talk about 10 years into Rails?
That's a good question. My best guess would be that when Rails first started getting popular, it was this great framework for prototyping quickly, right? And so you had a lot of small startups using it in an agile way, which is great. But you didn't have a lot of big enterprise apps, a lot of huge code bases, a lot of old code bases. And then it matured, and maybe 3 or 5 years ago, it started to get used by these bigger companies, these bigger teams, and code bases started to stick around longer than your standard startup. And I think within the past 2 years or so, we're reaching this tipping point where we're seeing a lot of those apps reach a size and a complexity where people are starting to realize, they're having a hard time developing new features without introducing bugs, or they're trying to reuse code in different ways and they don't know what to do, or various other things that come with these large code bases that may or may not have a good architecture associated with them.
So you've obviously begun to start to run into these problems as well at work. You work for Pivotal Labs, I'll say it correctly, and so is this talk kind of born out of stuff that you've learned on the job?
It definitely is. We've spent some time working on some fairly big, hairy code bases, kind of rescue projects, so we've seen how bad it can get. And I've done several projects like that. And much of the experience from this talk came from one specific project where we were building it from the ground up, and we knew this code base could get into one of these hairy situations, so we decided to think about architecture from day one, and see what we could do at the start to kind of put things or get things set off going in the right direction.
Now, some of these challenges are obviously code related and architecture related. Is there, to some extent, where it spans out into the broader thing of how you run your team and how you write code, not just the code that you write?
Yeah, it definitely branches out into like a little bit of process and the way you think about code. One thing that's kind of nice with engines is it gives you these boxes to work within. So you can have one team or one pair or one programmer work within a certain box or certain engine, and you can say, oh, I'm working within engine A, and someone else would be, oh, I'm working within engine B, and you're not going to have as many conflicts as you would with just one large Rails code base. The other thing is it forces you to really think about where you place things in your code base. So it's not like everything can just go under your models directory or everything can just go under a lib. You really have to think about, okay, I'm introducing a new domain object, and what engine should this go in? Does it fit in one of my existing engines, or does this need to go into a completely new one? So it kind of forces you to rethink everything.
So in your talk description, you mentioned performance as well. How does that scale? I mean, obviously, when an app gets bigger, it has more dependencies and stuff. But is there also a correlated kind of increase in usage, which means you have to make certain performance optimizations or decisions?
So in terms of scaling, these smaller pieces, these engines, can be, if you wanted to, taken and scaled on their own. It's fairly easy to take an entire engine, pull it out of your app, and put it in its own app, and then scale that completely on its own. It gives you those boundary boxes where you can pull things out if you want to. It doesn't necessarily give you that performance you need, But I would say on day one, you probably don't need that performance. Just give yourself that ability to, when you're ready to scale in the future, have those boxes you can pull out and scale individually.
Now, there's a bit of discussion that goes on around, the prime stack, and Rails almost has this divergence in opinions about should you actually have service objects, should you have any layer of abstraction around your models and that kind of thing. Obviously, this tends towards that direction. What do you think about that whole thing of the prime stack and doing it the Rails way?
So I think the Rails way gets you, or can get you, into a situation where you have a lot of code that's very tangled and hard to pull apart and refactor later. So, for example, user models, right? User.rb, a lot of Rails apps have a user.rb in them, right? And a lot of Rails apps, at least big Rails apps, have gigantic user models, tons and tons of lines of code, because that one user model is kind of intertangled with everything else. And the standard Rails way of doing things kind of promotes that. All the documentation, all the tutorials say, your user model should be attached to everything else in your system. So, your user model may have many posts or have many comments or have everything else that's in your system. So it's inherently tied to everything else. And the big thing for me is you can have a layer in between, your controllers and your models if you want. But the big thing for me is reducing that entanglement. So the user model doesn't need to have all the connections with every other domain object in your code base. You can invert that dependency and make sure that your comments or your blog posts or whatever else depend on your user model and not the other way around. And the way you enforce that can be through, a layer like you said, or it could be just through, making sure you don't create those dependencies that come out of your user model. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it's helpful. And now, how much of this, obviously this for you has come through battles and seeing how, it's battle scars, seeing how bad it can get, and then working to do that. How do you think, how well do you think we go about getting this information to people who might just be coming to Rails and so have been just taught the straight up Rails way?
That's a good question. Conferences are a great way to do it, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I think is that the Rails way of doing things is good, and it's good for a long time, and people really enjoy it. The thing that I feel like I want to do is at least let people know that there is another way to do it, and when they start seeing these problems, when they start realizing that, oh, I want to pull out authentication into some other service, and they realize how hard it is to do that, in the back of their mind, they can think back to my talk and be like, oh, maybe if we had architected this in a different way, this would have been much easier. So I think, having conferences, blog posts, videos like these that kind of give people an idea that there is something else out there that we can do, and, if this rings a bell with them and they're like, oh, yes, this really makes sense to me, then they can go out and start playing with this. Otherwise, it's something they can kind of file away in the back of their head, if they're new to Ruby, new to Rails, and they can kind of pick that back up when they find that they're starting to struggle with some of these issues.